Hi Year 11s and 12s. This is the second video in our mutation PowerPoint. So last time we looked at the different types of mutations that can occur in our DNA and in our genes. This time we're looking at the mutation rate. So what's actually going to affect the rate at which these mutations occur. The need to know will not be on this video, it's on the last video. It's got the second slide, the need to know for both the videos in the mutation PowerPoint. Let's begin. So mutation rate. Generally, mutations can be spontaneous, so they occur randomly, random errors occurring during DNA replication, but they can also be induced, which is when we say it's caused by something like a mutagenic factor, like a carcinogen, something like that. Mutation rates can be increased by exposure to things like ionizing radiation, mutagenic chemicals, or even viruses. Generally, our normal rate of mutation is caused by, so mutations do occur in our body without any exposure to other chemicals or radiation or viruses, etc. We do have a normal rate of mutation that's caused by errors in our DNA replication. So on average, the human body incurs around 16,000 base pair mutations every day due to those random errors as well as induced factors. The mutagens that we talked about on the last slide can also increase that rate of mutation though. So we're talking about things like ionizing radiation, non-ionizing radiation, mutagenic chemicals, as well as viruses. So with our ionizing radiation, we're talking about things like alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. What they'll actually do is they'll break the bonds in the DNA molecules, which cause both gene and chromosome mutations to occur. Non-ionizing radiation is things like UV radiation from the sun, which causes the adjacent thymine bases, so thymine bases are next to each other, forming chemical bonds between them, causing that gene mutation. We also have mutagenic chemicals. So mutagenic chemicals are chemicals that react and change the molecular structure of DNA. Generally, that will cause point mutations. The problem with these types of mutations is they can also stimulate oncogenes and proto-oncogenes, which will promote that uncontrolled cell division like we talked about last week. Last type of mutagen that can impact or increase the rate of mutation is viruses. So some viruses initiate uncontrolled cell division, and they do that by inserting oncogenes into the genome. Two viruses that we know are doing that are HIV-1 and the papillomavirus. Now, when we're talking about mutations, they can occur in both types of cells in our body. So we have two different types of cells in our body. We have germ cells and we have somatic cells. Germ cells are cells that can differentiate into gametes, or sex cells, whereas somatic cells are every other cell in the body that's not a gamete or a sex cell. Both of these types of cells are susceptible to gene mutations as well as chromosome mutations, and respectively, mutations that occur in somatic cells are known as somatic mutations, whereas mutations that happen in germ cells are called germinal mutations. Talking about both of these in detail, somatic mutations occur in all body cells, in all organs, except for our reproductive organs. They're generally localized to one organ or one tissue type though. Because they're not occurring in the germ cells, which means they're not being passed on to sex cells, they're not inherited. So they stay in the person that had that mutation occur. Somatic mutations in proto-oncogenes will give rise to cancer tumours. As we talked about last week, cancer cells are just differentiated somatic cells that have unregulated cell division. They're passed on to daughter cells during cell division, but that mutation will stay in the human body, not be passed on. Whereas germinal mutations occur in reproductive organs, and they'll be passed on when the germ cells differentiate into sperm or eggs, and will then be inherited by any offspring that are caused after that mutation. That means once that happens, they'll be present in every cell of that offspring. They generally don't cause changes in the phenotype of the individual which they occur, but obviously they will cause phenotype changes in the individual's offspring. Lastly, talking about mutation and genetic variation. So genetic variation involves changes in genotypes of populations over time. We'll talk about that a little bit more in ecosystems. Whereas we learnt in the last few PowerPoints, genes code for proteins, and those proteins will determine the phenotype, the physical appearance of an organism. When we have genetic variation in our genotype, that leads to different phenotypes because different proteins are created, creating a different appearance. We naturally have different forms of same genes in our bodies. We call these alleles. You talked about these in Year 10 science. And alleles code for the same phenotypic characteristic, but they have a different nucleotide, which means they are expressed differently. So, for example, you might have alleles for eye color. You might have one for brown and one for green. Depending on which one's the dominant, that'll be the one that you have that characteristic for. But the allele for brown eyes and the allele for green eyes actually have a different nucleotide sequence. Now, a single gene, so like eye color, can have thousands of different alleles. Okay? And the way that they occur is that new alleles arise from existing alleles through those spontaneous and induced mutations that we talked about in the last video.